We have been talking about ways in which people suffer. First, we talked about physical suffering, and last week we were talking about mental and emotional suffering. There are many ways in which people suffer, and we're touching on some of these areas and offering some suggestions along the way. Hopefully that will help us to bear the burden of the suffering that we encounter. Now tonight we're talking about fear. Last week we talked about grief. But fear is another way in which many people suffer. There are people who are just wrought full of fear, and therefore there's no peace, no tranquility to them in life. Now all fear is not bad. It's good for us in some ways. We use fear to teach our children, don't we? We teach them don't run out into the street. We try to tell them you may get run over, may get hurt. And if they do go out in the street, we may use a switch on them or something to help them learn that they don't go out in the street. And we tell them not to put their hands on a hot stove. And we use fear. And when they're very young, if they begin to touch it, we slap their hand. Hopefully, they'll be afraid to touch it then. We teach them not to drink things that they might find under the sink. And that's important. I knew a man some years ago who was unable to talk because as a little toddler he got into something under the sink and drank, and it ruined his vocal cords. And so we do these things to try to protect our kids. Fear is good for us along that line. A function of fear is to lead us away from evil and to God. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Now the fear that's spoken of there, I don't believe it just means just being terrified of God, but it means reverence and respect for God. A person ought to fear God because of who he is and what he is. And that fear should lead us to turn away from evil and turn toward good. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 20, Paul said, "Them that fear rebuke before all, that others also may fear." And so when a person is rebuked, it ought to encourage other people to be careful about what they do, lest they should be rebuked as well. In Hebrews 11 and verse 7, the Bible says, "By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house." It was the fear of God that led Noah to build that ark to save his household. Now that's the kind of fear we need to have. And the Bible encourages us to fear God in that sense. The other side of the coin is that the Bible teaches us not to fear in another way. In 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7, Paul tells us, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Now God does not give us that fear that indicates a lack of faith in him. He teaches us to trust him, have faith in him. And so that fear that's just being scared is not the kind of fear that we're to have. I think this is a neurotic fear and a lack of faith in God. That's the kind of fear that many people have. They are afraid of God. They're scared, but they don't respect and reverence God and do not obey his will. In Genesis 15 and verse 1, God said, "Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield." Now a shield is a protective armor. It was so long, so wide, they put their arms through some holders on the back, and they ward off the sword or the spears of the enemy, and their right hand holds the sword, an offensive weapon. And so that shield was to protect them. And God said he is Abraham's shield. There are many passages throughout the Bible that indicate that God is our shield as well. He will protect us and bless us. In 1 John 4, verse 18, John says, "There is no fear in love. For perfect love casteth out fear." And so if we love God, trust him, really believe in him, we're not afraid in that sense of being scared as some people are. So what causes this fear? And what does it do to us? Well, this kind of fear that we're talking about that's just being scared can rob us of our peace and joy and tranquility in life. I heard someone tell about a little boy who's in about the first grade, maybe 6 years old. He was going to be in a school play, and he was to say just one little sentence, "It is I, be not afraid." And he practiced it over and over again in class, and it was all right for him there, just their class members there, and he was able to say it. "It is I, be not afraid." But on the night of the play, he walked out on the stage and he saw all of those people out there, and he said, "It's me and I'm scared to death." That's the way it works with us sometimes, you see. We become afraid, and that doesn't involve fear and respect like we ought to have for God. You know, George Washington was a man who had some fears like that. It's hard to imagine that George Washington would be afraid, but it is said that he had a fear of being buried alive. And so he tried to make sure that everybody connected with him knew that his funeral was not to be held for at least 3 days, so they could be sure that he was really dead when they buried him. Now that's being scared, but that's not the fear that we ought to have. But that type of fear can rob us of all of our peace and joy in life. You can't really enjoy life if you are scared like that. Now what causes it? Well, sometimes fear is caused by a bad conscience, a guilty conscience. Solomon said in Proverbs 13:15, "The way of transgressors is hard." Now, when one transgresses the law, when he disobeys the law, he becomes afraid that he's going to get caught. He's always looking over his shoulder and see who's about to catch up with him. And it works that way with us. When we are guilty of some sin, breaking some law, it causes us to be a little bit afraid. In Genesis chapter 3, you remember that when Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, and then God came walking in the garden in the cool of the day, Adam and Eve did what? They tried to hide from God. Their guilt, because of their sin, made them want to hide from God, but of course they couldn't hide from Him. God knows where we are all the time. And so sometimes fear is caused by a guilty conscience. If we have a guilty conscience, to get rid of the fear, we need to get rid of that guilty conscience, take care of the thing that causes us to have that guilty conscience. Often, fear is caused by ignorance. Sometimes we are afraid when we don't know certain things. Why are children afraid of the dark? And almost all children are. Why are they afraid of the dark? They don't know what's out there in the darkness. They have some ideas, and it scares them to think about a boogeyman being out there, and it may get them. Sometimes it's ignorance that causes us to be afraid. There was a family that lived out in the country, and you know, out in the country they don't have street lights, and so it's dark outside. The mama and a little girl were in the kitchen. Mama spilled something, and she told her little girl, about 6 years old, "Step out on the back porch and get the broom and bring it in to me." When she started opening the door, she saw how dark it was outside. It was black as the ace of spades. And she said, "Mommy, I'm afraid to go out there. It's dark out there." And her mama said, "You don't need to be afraid. God is everywhere, and He's out there, and He'll take care of you. Go out and get the broom for me." And she went back to the door and cracked it just a bit and said, "God, if you're out there, will you please hand me the broom?" When we don't know what's out there, you see, it can cause us to be afraid. Children are sometimes afraid of the darkness. Adults can also be afraid when there is ignorance. They don't know what's going to come to pass. They can be afraid. If you've never had surgery and you're about to have to go into surgery, you're probably a little apprehensive. You may be a little bit afraid because you don't know what it's going to be like or what's going to happen. And so ignorance sometimes causes us to be afraid. Even adults can be that way. If we have to go for a job interview and we need a job badly, we may be a little apprehensive. We're afraid about what they may ask and whether we can answer the question and whether we will get the job. And so ignorance sometimes causes us to be afraid. The real cause of fear across the board, I believe, is a lack of faith in God, lack of trust in God. Last week I mentioned a story in Mark chapter 4 when Jesus and the apostles were crossing the sea. Jesus was taking a nap, and a big storm came up, and the disciples were very much afraid. And they found Jesus asleep, awakened him, and said, "Carest thou not that we perish?" Then you remember the statement that Jesus made in Mark chapter 4 and verse 40. "Why are you so fearful? Why is it that you have no faith?" You see, fear is caused by lack of faith. The apostles were greatly afraid because they really didn't have faith in the Lord. Now, I believe we mentioned last week, if a storm comes up with you in it, if Jesus is in your boat, you don't need to be afraid. If Christ is not in your life, if he's not in your boat, you might have reason to be afraid. But if Jesus is with us, if he's in our boat, then we don't need to be afraid. The approach of death sometimes can cause people to be afraid. I suspect that if we were asked individually, some of us would say, "I'm a little bit afraid to die." And there's probably a certain amount of fear in all of us because of that unknown factor in it. But you know, death was not designed to be a tragedy or a cause of sorrow for us. Death is really designed to be a blessing. In Psalm 116 and verse 15, the psalmist said, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." Now you think about that statement. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Death was designed to be a blessing to God's people. When you die in Christ as a faithful Christian, you leave behind all of the sorrows and the heartaches and troubles and problems that have caused us suffering in life. In Philippians 1:21, Paul said, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Death is a gain, not a loss, for those who are faithful children of God. And you remember that famous statement by David in the Shepherd Psalm, Psalm 23, verse 4, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." He didn't say, "I won't face any evil." He said, "I will fear no evil," because God's going to walk it with him. And he will walk with us through those dark valleys of life, and even through the valley of the shadow of death. Fear can be a destructive thing. It can rob you of your real joys of Christianity. All of us are familiar with the story of the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic. I have a sermon that I have preached from time to time that I entitle "The Sinking of the Titanic." Now, there are a number of scriptural principles that we can learn from the sinking of the Titanic. One of them is the fact that they were not prepared. They didn't have enough lifeboats on that ship. Not enough lifeboats to save all the people on that ship. And there were some who said God himself couldn't sink the Titanic. But they learned differently. When that thing hit the iceberg and knocked out part of the side of that ship and began to take in water, they began to think maybe it could be sunk. And it did. I met a lady one time who was on that ship that night. I told you that they didn't have enough lifeboats. They had some, and those people were so afraid that they got in too big a hurry and put some of those ships down in the water that had few people in them. They could have held many more people. Some of the lifeboats were only half filled, and there were people sliding off the ship when it tilted. They were out in the water, and some of them tried to climb into those lifeboats. But those people in the lifeboats were so afraid, they used the oars to knock them off and kept them from getting into the boats with them, because they were afraid that they would cause it to sink and all of them would die. Think of the fear that caused those people to knock people back in the water when they could have been saved. There was room in a number of those boats to save more people. That's what fear will do. I said I met a lady one time who was on that ship that night. Is there anyone else in this audience who has had that opportunity? Meet somebody who was on that ship. I've never met anybody else who had that opportunity. When I was preaching down in Wildwood, Florida, this lady was from the north and came down to visit some friends of hers there in with them. And I had an opportunity to preach the gospel with that woman in the audience. But I've often thought how I wish I had had the opportunity to talk with her privately and to talk to her about her feelings and what really happened on board that ship that night and that lifeboat. I believe that I would have been able to preach that sermon, the sinking of the Titanic, more effectively if I'd had that opportunity. Think of the fear in those people when they knew that ship was sinking. And then when they fell into the water and the others wouldn't let them get into one of those lifeboats. Fear can be destructive. The question for us is, what's the cure? How can we overcome that fear? Well, we need to gain an insight into our own hearts and why we are afraid. If you determine that you are afraid because you're living in sin, you can do something about that. Christ has made it possible for you to be forgiven, and you don't have to carry that burden of guilt. If you have never obeyed the gospel and you're afraid you're going to die and be lost eternally, you're carrying a burden you don't need to carry. You can obey the gospel, and He'll lift that burden from you. You don't have to be afraid. If you have obeyed the gospel in the past, but you haven't been a faithful Christian, you may be afraid that if you die, you're going to go to a devil's hell. But you don't have to carry that fear. You don't have to carry that burden. You can come back to the Lord and make it right, and you can have peace and tranquility. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Philippians 4 and verse 7. And so the cure, first of all, is to determine why you're afraid. If you're afraid because of sin, you need to make that right. If you know that fear comes from your punishment when you were a child, maybe your daddy carried a big stick and beat you with a big stick, as one young man I read about. As he grew up, he heard that God was a father, but his concept of the Father in heaven was that he'd be a man who carries a big stick and would hurt him. And so he was afraid to serve God. And so if our idea about God is wrong, we need to change our attitude and our thinking about God and understand that He is a Father who loves us, who gave His only begotten Son to redeem us. And so there's no need for us to be scared of God. We need to obey His will through fear, reverence, and respect. Perhaps more important than this insight into our hearts to determine why we are afraid, it may well be that we need to work on our faith. We need to come to believe in God, have a greater degree of faith in Him. In that passage in which David said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," there was a man who trusted God supremely, who believed in Him confidently, and he was not afraid to walk through that valley of the shadow of death because he knew that God would walk it with him. There are other passages that we need to impress upon our hearts. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. Casting all your care upon Him, for He careth for you. John 14 and verse 1, Jesus said, "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me." If we come to believe in Him, we don't have to be afraid. In John 14 verse 27, He said, "Peace I give unto you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth unto you, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." If you trust in the Lord, you don't have to be afraid. 2 Timothy 1 and 7, we noted a few moments ago, "For God has not given to us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." God causes us to think clearly if we will submit to Him and His will. The Bible teaches that faith will overcome fear. You remember when the children of Israel came to the land of Canaan the first time? God said, "I'll fight your battles for you. I'll give you the victory. Go into the land, you can have it." But the Israelites sent 12 men into the land to spy it out. 10 came back afraid. They said they are giants. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. They were afraid to go in and fight and take the land. Joshua and Caleb were the only ones who had faith in God. The people listened to the 10 rather than Joshua and Caleb. They returned back to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then when that generation died out, those who were 40 years old and older, they came again to the land of Canaan. And God said, go in and take the land. I'll give it to you. I'll fight your battles for you. This time they had faith in God. They went into the land. There were still giants there, probably more giants than were there 40 years earlier. But that didn't matter. God and one man can lick the whole bunch. If God be for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. So their faith overcame their fears. And it'll do the same for us. When we come to have greater faith, we have less fear. Faith in God will overcome it. Well, let's look at another. Depression. Oftentimes, people become depressed when they suffer in some way, especially when grief comes upon them. We become depressed and thinking there's no answer to it. We're hurting, and we can't seem to find an answer. The basic element in depression is helplessness. We feel that we're helpless. We can't do a thing about this particular problem. Usually, depression grows out of some loss. Maybe it's the loss of your health. You have a disease, and when the doctor says, I don't like the looks of that x-ray, and he tells you that you have a very scary illness, you may become depressed and think there's nothing that can be done. Maybe it's the loss of a job. Maybe the loss of a loved one. Especially the loss of a loved one. You no longer have that one with you anymore, and you're depressed, and you don't see an answer to it. Maybe even a divorce can bring you to depression. Your mate may be divorcing you, and it breaks your heart. You don't seem to be able to do a thing about it, and so you go into depression. What can be done? How do we overcome it? Well, first of all, we need to begin within ourselves. We need to determine who we are and what we are, have a proper understanding of who we are. Some years ago, I heard someone tell about a man who went to see a psychiatrist. Now, when he went to see the psychiatrist, he had a watermelon under each arm, and he had a slice of bacon wrapped around each ear, and a horned owl on the shoulder. He went into the psychiatrist and said, I came to talk to you about my brother. That's the wrong one to talk about. We need to talk about self. And if we're going to overcome the problem of depression, we need to look within ourselves and see who we are and what we are. And remember, we're God's child. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. We need to understand that we are a child of God, and God can help us overcome whatever depression we may have. It's healthy to recognize who one is and what he is. If we're children of God, we have something that those outside of Christ don't have. We have resources that will help us to meet and overcome those things that hurt us in life. Number two, the second step is to remember the circumstances, that circumstances do not control us. We are creatures of choice. We can decide what we're going to do. And if we want to overcome depression, we can do it with God's help. We can make up our mind that we're going to take the steps that will enable us to overcome depression. We are creatures of choice. God has given us that power. And then in the third place, depression seems to be dispelled when a person turns his attention outward. If we are depressed, one important thing to remember is we need to turn our attention outward. We are depressed when our attention is focused upon us. Turn our attention outward. Dr. Carl Menninger was a famous psychiatrist some years ago. He was one of the founders of the Menninger Psychiatric Clinic in Kansas. On one occasion, a reporter asked him a question. Suppose that you suspect you're heading for a nervous breakdown. What would you do? He expected the psychiatrist to say, go to see a psychiatrist. But that's not what he said. Dr. Menninger said, go straight to your front door, turn the knob, open the door, and then go across the tracks and find someone who needs you. You know, that's very similar to what Jesus said when he said, he who loves his life for my sake will find it. If we give up self, if we lose our life for his sake, we'll find it. If we become involved in other people's hurts, we'll forget about some of ours. One of the easiest ways to overcome depression is to go out and find somebody who needs you, someone else who needs encouragement, someone else who needs help. And if you'll do that, you will overcome some of this thing that's been hurting you for so long. Still another suggestion is proper conditioning of your own health. Take care of your health. Do the things that will enable you to be healthy. And you will find that the healthier you are, the less you will be depressed. You'll feel better when you take care of your own health. And then finally, surround yourself with the proper attitude and people who have the proper attitude. You know, some people need a checkup from the neck up. Need to get the attitudes right. And if we do that, it will help us with our hurts, especially this feeling of depression. Read a good book that'll help you get your attitude right. You know, sometimes we think we're being positive when we're not. A little boy was going to play a Little League game one night, and he said to his mama that day, we're going to lose that game tonight. His mama said, be positive. He said, all right, I'm positive. We're going to lose that game tonight. That's how we are sometimes with our attitudes. We need to change our attitude. Get rid of that stinking thinking. Read a good book like Norman Vincent Peale's book, The Power of Positive Thinking. He will help you to think positively. And if we begin to think positively, we'll find ourselves doing better, feeling better. Read Willard Tate's book, How to Get What You Want and Then Want What You Get. That has to do with one's attitude. Some of us in the audience tonight went to school with Willard Tate at Alabama Christian College back before the flood sometime. Willard graduated there. He became the basketball coach, a very successful one. He went to Abilene as a coach. He became a public speaker, speaking here and there, trying to change the attitudes of people. And he put that material together into his book, How to Get What You Want and Then Want What You Get. When we do that, when we begin to get our thinking in order, think positively, we'll be able to overcome those feelings of depression. Brother Tom Holland died not long ago. He was a great man, great gospel preacher, a very knowledgeable man, and he wrote many, many books. Some of them deal with right thinking. He wrote several books on humor. I have several of them in my library. And I always love to read books like that. Good, clean jokes, good stories. They help you to think positively and to be happy. Read some of Tom Holland's books. And I think it would help you overcome whatever feelings of depression you have. We need to learn to laugh. I think humor is good for us. I believe the Bible teaches it. Solomon said in Proverbs 17, verse 22, A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. It's good for us to have a merry heart. I believe it's good to use good humor to illustrate things. We can see the point, and it'll also lift our feelings. Laughter lifts the spirits and makes it difficult to be discouraged. In summary on that point, let me suggest several things. Once we learn to forget about ourselves, we're on the path to recovery from depression. And so again, I'll say, if we begin to think about other people, think of others who are in need, who need encouragement from you because they are depressed, you will find that it will help you with your depression. Second, become more involved in the work of the church and help others. There again is that idea of helping others. If you are having trouble with depression, find something you can do in the church that would help the cause of Christ, and you will begin getting better yourself. Number 3, we mentioned Elijah the other night and the fact that he became depressed. I ask you to read those chapters in 1 Kings chapters 17, 18, and 19. Read that story, and you'll see that Elijah became depressed. He thought that he was the only one left serving God. But God let him know that there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knees to Baal. And the angel ministered to him. And he overcame his depression. He tried to hide, and stop working. But he overcame his depression when he went back to work. Started again doing the things that God wanted him to do. So the basic solution to depression involves trusting God. Turn to God, get more involved in serving God, and He will help you to overcome those problems of depression. And then there is the problem of loneliness. This is, I believe, one of the greatest sources of suffering for people. There are people who are very lonely. It's one of the deadliest diseases of our age. Loneliness can be the most desolate word in the human language. It is no respecter of persons, whether we be old or young, rich or poor, educated or uneducated. Loneliness is a problem for us. It is no respecter of persons. Back when I was preaching full-time before I retired, through all those years of preaching, I tried to vary my type of sermons that I would preach. On Sunday nights, I would often present a sermon in song. We would sing during the sermon, talk about certain points and sing songs that illustrate it. Or we'd talk about the song itself and what it means. And then I also had question and answer sermons. I would have people to give questions to me, and I would try to answer them in a sermon. I have 40 to 50 sermons, I guess, I've used in my years of preaching, answering questions for people. On one occasion, this card was given to me. How do you handle loneliness when you feel there are no people who really care about you? When you feel people only care about you because it's their duty? Sometimes I feel like a lost card in the shuffle. I keep making the effort to make a friendship, but no one makes an effort for my friendship. I know Jesus loves me and He's my friend, but don't you need an earthly friend as well? You know, that hit home with me. I feel that there are people who are suffering because of loneliness. And I tried to answer that question from a biblical standpoint. This person said, please answer these in one of your sermons. We tried to give them some help with loneliness. Sometimes we are very lonely. We feel no one loves us, no one cares for us. Psychologists Rubenstein and Schaefer note that 15% of Americans feel lonely most of the time. 78% feel lonely some of the time. Folks, that's 3 out of every 4 feel lonely some of the time. and only 6% never feel lonely. Let me mention some who are lonely. Older people are lonely. When people get old, oftentimes some of their friends have died and they are left alone. And we don't care as much for older people as we do younger people generally. In America, we place an emphasis upon youth, not upon age. And older people sometimes become very lonely. And young mothers sometimes are very lonely. They don't have much opportunity to associate with people over 2 feet high. I heard about a lady who was caring for little children. She and her husband were invited to a sit-down meal, a big party for the employees for a certain company. And she happened to be sitting by the owner of the company. And they were about halfway through the meal before she realized she was cutting up the man's meat and feeding him and using his napkin to wipe his mouth. You see. She was so used to doing that for her little children, she didn't have much experience with older people. Sometimes young mothers are very lonely. Housewives become lonely. They have to stay at home and work, and the husbands are out running around, the children are in school. They get very lonely. The single person becomes lonely. The divorced person becomes very lonely. And we could help people like that if we are aware of it. And new residents are lonely. When people move into an area, sometimes they're very lonely. And we could be alert to that and maybe open the door of opportunity. Or when people come to visit with us for the first time, they could be lonely, sitting by themselves, nobody speaks to them. Now here we have a number of folks who drift around and speak to people, and that's good. I observe that because I try to do it. And as a preacher, I've always tried to do that. There are good people, very fine people, who do not go to speak to a stranger like that. They find it difficult. I'd like to encourage us all to work on that. If you see somebody you don't know here in the services, go to speak to them. Meet them. Make them feel welcome. But if they come and sit here and nobody says anything to them, when they leave, that's probably the last time they'll be here. But if we're warm and friendly, it'll help them because they're lonely people. And then sometimes there are other people who are lonely, like teens and college students. My wife and I often eat over at the cafeteria once or twice a week while they're in session. And a year or so ago, we were eating over there right at the beginning of the year. New students had come in, and they were sitting around tables here and there, laughing and talking, enjoying themselves. And I noticed a young girl sitting over here by herself. No one was sitting with her. I hoped that some students would go and sit with her during the meal, but they never did. She looked very lonely, very sad, and I don't remember seeing her anymore. I suspect she left and went back home. And that's a tragic thing. Young people need someone to help them when they're lonely. Well, our time is up. Good to have you. Next week we'll have a singing, and then the following week I'll continue another couple weeks or so. Come back and be with us.